I just faced my own worst nightmare when the HOA president sold my land while I was deployed, with her excuse being that they needed a better owner because I had unpaid assessments and covenant violations. But the funny thing is, the only thing repossessed that day was her entire scheme by the National Guard, sheriff, and marshals when they got involved. Let me start from the beginning. Texas taught me this. The meanest weapons wear pearls and carry bylaws. I'm Mark Thomas, but everyone calls me Tank. And in the Army, I took hits and kept moving. But back home, I had to do it daily against Karen Cromwell, our HOA president, who ran Willowbrook like her private kingdom. My office was my grandpa's red barn with hand-cut boards, sawdust, and old leather in the air, and from that desk, I watched the 10 acres he left me. The mesquite pit, the pond, the wide sky. Not property, but bloodline, though to Karen, it was just real estate. I was on a video call that made my palms sweat with Investigator Miller from the Texas Attorney General's office, a man with a serious face and tired eyes, while Elena, my wife, my rock, my one-woman command center, sat beside me tracking the call stability since out here. Cell service gets sketchy, especially when storm clouds looked angry. Miller asked me to confirm that Ms. Cromwell and the Willowbrook HOA initiated foreclosure proceedings on my property while I was on active duty, and I confirmed it with my training, keeping my voice even and calm under fire, explaining how they tacked on thousands in fake fines for landscaping violations, like grass being too green, and fines for a fence my grandpa built 50 years before the HOA existed. Sending notices to the house, knowing I was deployed while my wife fought it, but they buried her in paperwork. Trying to steal my home over a manufactured debt of $840. They pushed it to a trustee sale while I was overseas. The gavel fell at noon, and the deed was recorded to Cromwell Holdings, Karen's shell company, selling my land while I was deployed. Elena had discovered this wasn't just about us. Karen was a predator, targeting military families across the subdivision, using the Service Members Civil Relief Act as her personal loophole, knowing the law was meant to protect us, but twisting it for her benefit. Miller said the SCRA violation was significant, but proving criminal intent was the hard part. Needing more than just suspicious fines, they needed a smoking gun. And I leaned forward, saying, I believed we had one. My grandfather, the original owner of this land, was a smart man who, when he sold off the surrounding acreage that became Willowbrook, held on to the mineral rights, not just for this homestead, but for the entire subdivision, which made Miller's eyebrows shoot up since it meant oil, gas, and more importantly in Texas, water. It was all mine, right under their feet, including the HOA's fancy irrigated lawns, their community pool, even the water in their toilets. Before Miller could respond, a shadow fell across the barn's open doorway, followed by the sound of splintering wood as the heavy oak door my grandpa had hung flew inward, kicked off its hinges with a sickening crack, slamming against an old saddle rack and sending it crashing to the floor, revealing Karen Cromwell standing there silhouetted against the afternoon sun. She wasn't tall, but she had a presence that sucked all the air out of the room, wearing a floral pink cardigan over a white blouse with pearls bright at her throat. Completely wrong for a dusty barn. Her blonde hair pulled into a severe weaponized bun, with two large men in matching gray polo shirts embroidered with HOA compliance behind her, looking less like they were there to measure grass height and more like they were there to break kneecaps. Karen's eyes, cold and blue as a winter pond, flicked from me to Elena, then to the laptop screen, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips as she said, she heard I was back and saw I was already busy spreading lies, her voice smooth and cultured, but with an edge like broken glass as she stepped into my barn, my private space, my office, her men flanking the doorway with arms crossed, blocking our only way out. On the screen, I could see Investigator Miller's face, frozen in a mask of disbelief, as he watched a crime happen in real time. my training kicking in for threat assessment, 2 hostiles plus the primary antagonist. No visible weapons, but their size was a weapon. My heart rate not spiking, but settling into a low, steady drum since fight or flight is for people with options. And I just had a barn to defend. Elena's hand tightened on my arm, her breathing steady because she was a soldier's wife who knew the drill. And I told Karen in a dangerously calm voice that she just kicked in my door, was trespassing, and had made a big mistake in front of a state official, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second as she glanced at the laptop again. She was smart, I'll give her that, but also arrogant, thinking she was untouchable with no idea how many friends I had. Having kicked in my door during a video call with the Attorney General, thinking it was a power move when, for me, it was a gift. The hook was set. Now I just had to reel her in. 2 local officers called by Karen rushed in while I was still in uniform from base, and she lied saying I assaulted her. So they cuffed me and walked me toward the cruiser while Miller watched on the laptop, stunned. But Elena played the door cam clip showing Karen kicking first. The cuffs came off. The sergeant muttered an apology and walked me back inside, and Karen smiled like she'd still won. Before I could savor the moment, or Karen could fully process the tactical blunder she just made on a recorded line with the state, the world went dark and silent. The lights in the barn flickered once, then died. The hum of the air conditioner cut out. The laptop screen showing investigator Miller's shocked face went black, and my cell phone, lying on the desk, lost its single bar of service, creating complete isolation since somebody was running a portable cell jammer, illegal but effective at killing bars fast. Elena squeezed my hand in a silent signal. Power cut. Comms out. And I knew what it meant. This wasn't a random outage from the coming storm, but deliberate. Karen's next move, showing she wasn't just arrogant, but thorough, her smile returning wider and more menacing, the temporary loss of light making her teeth seem to glow as she said with mock sympathy that I was having technical difficulties, but not to worry since her associates were just there to conduct a compliance inspection for the good of the community. She knew she'd cut me off from the outside world and believed she had me trapped. But my grandpa always said, never mistake a quiet man for a weak man, and that when a bully cuts the lights, it's because they're afraid of what you'll do when you can see clearly. He'd bought this homestead after his own service, a piece of quiet to call his own in the rolling hills outside Austin, and he was a surveyor who understood the land, not just what was on it, but what was under it, selling to developers in the 80s, but keeping what he called the real treasure, the mineral rights, a footnote in a thick legal document that slick developers probably laughed at, though oil and gas were a long shot. The water rights were his legacy, his insurance policy, telling me once that land is honest but people aren't, so always own what they can't see. He'd passed away 2 years ago right before my last deployment, and I inherited the homestead, the 10 acres, the barn, the pond, and that dusty old deed filed away in his roll-top desk. Not thinking much of it at the time since it was just a piece of paper, a memory of a wise old man being more worried about leaving Elena alone to handle things. Karen Cromwell had been a thorn in the community's side for years, getting onto the HOA board with a campaign of smiles and promises, then consolidating power with bylaw changes and intimidation tactics that would make a dictator blush, stacking the board with her cronies while good people and decent neighbors were fined into submission or sold their homes just to get away from her. Then she set her sights on my place, the original parcel, the heart of Willowbrook that wasn't under her thumb since my grandpa never joined the HOA and didn't have to. But when I inherited it, Karen saw her chance. While I was in a desert halfway around the world, the violation notices started coming. Elena called me frantic about fines for weeds that didn't exist, a citation for the color of the barn door that had been that color for 60 years, a demand to remove the mesquite pit because it wasn't a pre-approved structure, and Elena fought every single one. going to board meetings with her binder of evidence in hand, while they smiled condescendingly and voted against her, burying her in legal threats, bleeding us dry dollar by dollar, fine by fine. The $800 lien was the final straw, the key they needed to start foreclosure proceedings, so Elena called JAG, and the lawyers in uniform took one look and saw the SCRA violation clear as day, since a service member on active duty cannot have their property foreclosed on like this. It's the law. But Karen was clever, walking a fine line, using a web of civil actions to make it look legitimate, counting on us to give up and not have the resources or will to fight from a war zone. But she underestimated Elena, and she underestimated me. Back in the dark barn, the only light came from the open door, framing Karen and her two bookends, my eyes having adjusted so I could see every detail. The smug certainty on her face, the bored, brutal look on her guards' faces, my grandpa's legacy at stake, my home, my wife's safety, the core question echoing in my mind of how far will a man go to defend his own? And I was about to find out. I stood up slowly and told Karen in a low voice that she cut the power, was blocking my road, had trespassed and assaulted me, all in front of a witness from the AG's office, thinking she'd cornered me. But I took a step toward her as her goons tensed, continuing in a voice like gravel that she hadn't cornered me, but had just declared war and had no idea who she was fighting. From the corner of my eye, I saw Elena slip away from the desk and move toward the back of the barn, her movement silent and practiced, the phone tree down and internet out. Phase 1 of Karen's plan complete. But Phase 2 of ours was just beginning as the first rumble of thunder echoed across the prairie, and the storm was coming. The real one. The quiet hum I heard, not in my head, but real. Coming from the back of the barn where Elena had just fired up the generator, the real fight about to start, and Karen had just given us everything we needed to win it. The generator sputtered to life with a reassuring roar, a sound that cut through the manufactured silence Karen had tried to impose. A string of bare work bulbs strung along the barn's rafters, flickering on and casting long, dancing shadows as Karen and her two thugs flinched at the sudden light, having expected me to be a victim in the dark, not knowing this barn had its own power, its own pulse, built for self-sufficiency, just like my grandpa, just like me. Karen sneered, "Impressive, a generator. But your phones still don't work, do they? No one is coming to help you." And she was right about the phones being a dead zone, but wrong about the help, since my help wasn't coming. It was already here as Elena emerged from the back, holding a ruggedized tablet, the screen glowing like a beacon in the dusty air, saying, "Scout is airborne," in a calm, clear voice, Scout being our eye in the sky, a high-end quadcopter drone with a thermal camera, my welcome home gift to myself. Karen's face tightened since she hadn't counted on a drone, and I turned my attention back to her, telling her this was her last chance to walk away and take her muscle with her off my property. But one of her goons, the bigger of the two, chuckled, asking, "Or what? You going to call the cops?" "Oh, wait," as he tapped his ear about no signal, but I ignored him and looked directly at Karen, saying this wasn't a threat, but friendly advice, since she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her response was to gesture to her men to check the property for compliance violations and be thorough, a pretext and flimsy excuse to let her thugs run rampant, intimidate, and search for something they could use against me. But as they started to move past me, I heard a loud horn blare from down the street, then another, glancing toward the open barn door to see a large white pickup truck pulling sideways across our gravel road, blocking the entrance, with another doing the same at the other end of the block. Homeowners Association logos were slapped on their doors, hired guards like the kind Karen used for her patrols getting out and setting up a perimeter, blockading the entire street since Willowbrook's roads are private HOA property, and she thought that gave her the right to seal them. Not just isolating me, but the whole neighborhood, cutting us off. My neighbor Jerry's house was within the blockade, Jerry being a retired colonel who believed in rules and regulations but not tyranny, having fed me information for weeks about Karen's shady dealings, keeping receipts of every questionable invoice and suspicious contract the HOA signed, being on our side, but now trapped too in what I murmured to Elena was a full-blown siege. Karen having gone completely off the rails. Elena didn't look up from her tablet, saying Karen was desperate since the AG call spooked her, and she was trying to contain the damage, tapping the screen to show Scout had eyes on the whole street, and they were turning people away at the blockade. The genius of Elena being her foresight in establishing a neighborhood phone tree weeks ago, a low-tech chain of communication for exactly this kind of scenario, but with the cell network down, it was useless. Or so Karen thought. I asked quietly if Freddie was on the net, Elena nodding and patching him in now, neighbor Freddie being our secret weapon, a ham radio enthusiast who looked like Santa Claus and sounded like a gravelly voice disc jockey, our backup comms, Elena keeping the video on a closed Wi-Fi link while Freddie relayed play-by-play over ham radio so neighbors could follow. Old school tech meeting new school tech. As Karen's goons started poking around my workshop, opening cabinets and tossing tools aside, I knew their real target wouldn't be in the barn since they were creating a distraction, telling Elena they were going for her truck, the logical next step to discredit us and make us look like the criminals. Elena's truck parked right outside the barn being an easy target. Elena replied that Scout was watching, her fingers flying across the screen as she angled the tablet so I could see the thermal image showing two figures detaching from the main group of guards at the blockade and slinking along the fence line, staying in the shadows, heading for the driveway. So I needed to keep Karen and her two clowns occupied here in the barn. I leaned against my workbench, crossing my arms, telling Karen that my grandpa always said, "You can judge a person's character by the company they keep," looking pointedly at the two oversized goons who were now clumsily trying to look intimidating while rifling through a box of old spark plugs. One of them holding up a rusty wrench declaring, "This isn't up to code." And I almost laughed, telling him that wrench was older than his parents, and to show some respect. Karen's patience was wearing thin as the generator hummed. The light stayed on. The drone was in the air. And I wasn't panicking since this wasn't going according to her script, so she hissed at her men to find something. While on Elena's tablet, the two figures reached her truck, one standing lookout while the other jimmied the lock on the passenger side door, it popping open with a soft click barely audible over the rising wind of the storm. Elena whispered, "They're in," as the figure leaned inside, pulling a small dark package from his jacket, reaching under the passenger seat and planting something. Contraband, drugs, a weapon. It didn't matter what it was, since it was the kind of thing that would turn a civil dispute into a felony investigation, discrediting me and Elena and making the AG's case against her evaporate. The whole neighborhood listening in on their radios about to watch Karen's hired help commit a felony, live on the air. But watching wasn't enough. We had to stop them without tipping our hand that we knew exactly what they were doing. So I caught Elena's eye and she gave me a subtle nod, having an idea. The trap set, and now time to spring it. The question not being if we could catch them, but how to make it hurt the most when we did. Elena's voice was a low whisper, but the microphone on her headset would carry it clear as a bell across the airwaves as she said, "All right, Freddie, you're live," followed by a crackle of static. Then Freddie's voice booming with goofy gravitas. "Neighbor Freddie is on the air, and we are looking at some top-tier shenanigans, folks." Scout cam is crystal clear. We got two fellas, let's call them Shifty and Grifty, breaking into Elena's pickup. That is a big no-no in the Lone Star State. Listeners, I had to suppress a smile since Freddie was a character, but he was our character. His running commentary being broadcast to at least a dozen homes on our blockaded street, turning Karen's siege into a dinner theater performance for the whole neighborhood. Back in the barn, Karen was getting agitated while her two stooges were still pretending to conduct a compliance inspection, one of them looking at a stack of firewood and declaring, "This stack is irregular." And I couldn't help myself, saying, "It's firewood, genius. It's supposed to be irregular. You want it to be uniform, go buy a Duraflame log." Karen shooting me a look that could curdle milk and telling me to shut up. On the tablet, I watched the thermal signature of the man I now thought of as Grifty, who had the package under Elena's seat and was just pulling his hand back out. So it was time, and I said loud enough for Karen and her crew to hear, "Now, Elena, honey, did you remember to lock your truck?" With all this commotion, I'd hate for someone to mess with it. Perfect bait that was simple, domestic, and utterly disarming. Elena played her part perfectly, her eyes going wide with faux panic as she said, "Oh my gosh, I don't think I did." My purse is in there, and made a move for the door, but one of Karen's goons stepped in her way, growling, "Nobody's going anywhere. This is an official inspection." Karen watched the exchange with a smug little smirk on her face, thinking we were falling right into her trap, believing her men outside were undiscovered, having no idea they were the stars of Willowbrook's new favorite reality show. Elena looked at me with her face a mask of worry, then looked down at the tablet in her hand, saying, "Well, if I can't go out there," her thumb swiping across the screen and tapping an icon labeled with a simple lightning bolt. And on the live feed from Scout, I saw the lights on Elena's truck flash once. Then the horn let out two short, sharp honks. The remote lock and panic button feature standard on most vehicles. But we'd added a little custom modification. Grifty, the man planting the evidence, jumped back from the truck as if he'd been zapped with a cattle prod, looking around wildly while Shifty, his lookout, grabbed his arm trying to pull him back into the shadows, thinking they had just triggered the car alarm. But they were wrong. Karen snapped, "What was that?" her head whipping toward the sound, and I said casually, "Just my wife locking her truck. A little late, I guess." But on the drone feed, something else was happening, as a thin wisp of smoke curled out from the passenger side door of the truck. Then another. Then a lot more. Not black smoke, but thick, white, and billowing. Freddie's voice crackled over the comms in my earpiece. And the crowd goes wild. It appears our contestant Grifty has won himself a little prize. That ain't smoke, neighbors. That's military-grade pepper fog. Looks like Elena's truck has an anti-theft system they don't sell at the dealership. We'd rigged the OC system and posted a warning decal months ago. Elena having rigged a small, remotely triggered canister under the dash designed for crowd control, harmless, but incredibly effective at making a small enclosed space completely uninhabitable. The cab of her truck now a swirling vortex of concentrated pepper spray. Grifty and Shifty stumbled back, coughing and sputtering, clawing at their eyes, blinded and choking and covered in evidence. The package they had tried to plant still on the floor of the truck, now marinating in a cloud of pure misery. Karen knew immediately what had happened. The color draining from her face as her plan to frame us had literally gone up in smoke right in front of her. Her goons in the barn looking confused, glancing from me to their boss. Not smart enough to grasp the full implication, but able to smell failure. And it smelled a lot like pepper spray. Karen stammered, "My men? They were just patrolling." And I asked, letting the sarcasm drip, "Patrolling the inside of my wife's truck? That's a new one." "Don't worry, Karen. We have the whole thing on camera, high definition and thermal. The AG's office is going to love the instant replay," nodding toward the tablet in Elena's hand and saying we'd send them a copy as soon as she and her roadblocks were gone. The standoff was broken. The power had shifted decisively. Karen standing there trapped between her failed plan and her two useless enforcers, the sound of her men retching and wheezing outside being a symphony of incompetence as thunder got louder and closer, the wind rattling the tin roof of the barn, the sky turning a bruised, ugly shade of purple. The storm about to break and the world holding its breath. Karen looked at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of emotion. Not arrogance anymore, but pure, unadulterated hatred. Having tried to frame us and having it turned into a public spectacle, the blockade still up and power still out. But she had lost control of the narrative, and a control freak like Karen couldn't stand that. So she spun on her heel, her face a thundercloud, spitting, "This isn't over, Mark," and marching out of the barn, her goons scrambling to follow her like scolded puppies. I knew she was right. This wasn't over, but just the end of a chapter. Her next move not being about subtlety or framing, but about brute force. The storm coming and Karen Cromwell about to become even more dangerous. The moment Karen stormed out, the atmosphere in the barn shifted. The immediate threat gone, but a heavier, more ominous feeling settling in like right before a hurricane makes landfall. The wind howling outside, and the first heavy drops of rain beginning to hammer against the metal roof like drum fire. Since this wasn't just a storm, but a full-blown Texas gully washer, the kind that turns dusty creek beds into raging torrents in minutes. Elena didn't waste a second, saying, "Jerry's on the line," and pointing to her headset, explaining he said the water was rising fast at the low-water crossing. The only way in or out of the back half of our neighborhood, a concrete slab laid over a creek usually bone dry. But with the main road blockaded by Karen's goons, it was the only potential escape route for anyone on our street and about to disappear under a flash flood. I asked, "Freddie, what does Scout see?" Moving to stand behind Elena and peering at the tablet. Freddie's voice coming back with the goofy tone replaced by genuine concern. "Whoa, Nellie. Colonel Jerry ain't kidding. That creek looks angry. It's already over the road. And hold on, I got a car down there." The drone's camera zooming in and cutting through the rain to show a small sedan stalled right in the middle of the crossing. Brown water swirling up past its hubcaps, the water rising with terrifying speed. Elena asked, "Can you see who it is?" And Freddie was silent for a moment before saying, "License plate is HOA 2. That's the treasurer's car." "That's David." David Chen being the HOA treasurer. A quiet, nervous man who always seemed terrified of his own shadow and especially of Karen. One of her cronies, but not one of the true believers. A follower motivated by fear. And right now, he was trapped. The core of my being, the soldier part, took over since it didn't matter who was in that car. A person was in danger. And you don't leave someone behind, ever. So I said, "I'm going," already grabbing my heavy-duty rain gear and a coil of rope from a hook on the wall. Elena looked at me, her eyes filled with worry, but she didn't argue since she knew me and knew this was something I had to do, saying, "Be careful, Tank," with a tight voice, adding that Scout would be my eye in the sky. And I said into my own comms unit, "Freddie, talk to me. Keep me updated on the water level." Him replying, "You got it, Tank. Just don't do anything I wouldn't do," which gives you a lot of leeway, come to think of it. A flash of his usual humor, even now that helped. I burst out of the barn and into the deluge, the wind nearly tearing the door from my hand, rain flying sideways and stinging my face, while I could hear the roar of the creek from 100 yards away. My big Ford F-250 being my go-to for situations like this with the clearance and power I needed. As I climbed in, I saw Karen standing on her porch down the street, a silhouette against the lighted window of her perfect house, watching and seeing the car, seeing me getting ready, and doing nothing, just standing there, letting one of her own people face the flood alone, which told me everything I needed to know about her. I gunned the engine and tore across my own lawn, bypassing the useless road and heading straight for the back of my property, which bordered the creek, the truck's big tires churning through the mud as I could see the crossing now, the water, churning brown monster filled with debris, David's little sedan being rocked by the current with water already halfway up its doors. Freddie's voice crackled in my ear. "He's still inside, Tank. He's trying to get out, but the door won't open. Water pressure." And I knew I couldn't drive into that, since even my truck would get swept away. So I parked on the high bank, jumped out, and secured one end of the rope to my trailer hitch, yelling into the mic, "Elena, can you get Scout right over him? I need to see his face." Her replying instantly, "On it." Teet. The drone was a ghost in the storm, its rotors fighting the wind, and on my phone, which was linked to the feed, I saw David's terrified face pressed against the driver's side window as he was panicking, so I tied a loop in the other end of the rope, making a makeshift harness since I had to get to him. There was no other choice, and waded into the flood. The cold, powerful current immediately grabbed at my legs, trying to pull me under, each step being a battle. The water waist deep, then chest deep. A stupid risk, but a calculated one. When Freddie yelled, "Tank, he's trying to climb out the window!" I saw it happen as David, in his desperation, managed to squeeze through the open window of his car. But the moment he was out, the current caught him, sweeping him off the car and under, bobbing back up a second later, flailing 50 feet downstream. From me and moving fast, he was going to drown. There was no time to think, so I took a deep breath, braced myself, and launched forward, letting the current take me while aiming for a point ahead of him in a controlled fall. A desperate gamble. The water, a chaotic mess of branches and mud. As I surfaced, gasping, and saw him just a few feet away, lunging with my fingers closing around the collar of his soaked polo shirt. I had him, now, for the hard part. I was holding on to a panicking, full-grown man with one arm while fighting a flash flood with the other, the rope being my only hope as I pulled on it hand over hand, the coarse fiber burning my palms, every inch being a victory. My boots finding. No purchase on the slick creek bed, just pulling against the full force of the flood, my muscles screaming and lungs burning, thinking for a second we were lost. Then I felt a change as the pulling got easier, looking up toward the bank and seeing through the sheeting rain a figure, Colonel Jerry, who'd come out of his house and was at the back of my truck, hauling on the rope with me, and together we dragged ourselves and a sputtering, terrified David Chen onto the muddy bank. We lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the three of us, while the storm raged around us, and I had gone out to save a man who was part of the machine trying to crush me without hesitating. And as David coughed up creek water and looked at me not with gratitude, but with raw, soul-shaking terror that had nothing to do with the flood, I realized something. He wasn't afraid of the storm, but afraid of Karen. Afraid of what she would do to him. As he lay there shivering, he reached inside his drenched jacket, his hand shaking uncontrollably, not reaching for a phone or wallet, but pulling out a small waterproof zip drive, pushing it into my hand with pleading eyes, whispering, "Take it. It's everything. The real ledger. Please." And in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the fight for my home, the game had just completely changed, since the one thing we needed most had just been delivered by the flood. I stared at the zip, drive in my hand, small and black, but feeling heavier than a block of lead. David Chen looking at me with the eyes of a man who had just betrayed a monster and was praying he'd pick the winning side as I asked, "The real ledger?" Barely a whisper, against the wind, and he nodded, shivering violently from cold and fear, explaining, "She keeps 2 sets of books, one for the auditors, a clean one. The other one, that's where everything is. The missing reserve funds, the kickbacks from contractors, the illegal payments to the compliance officers," coughing with a racking sound and adding, "She was going to get rid of me. The storm. It was the perfect excuse." She told me to go check the drainage culvert at the crossing. She knew it would flood. Karen hadn't just stood by and watched him nearly drown. She had sent him there to die. A line even I hadn't expected. Her to cross, since this wasn't about a house anymore, but attempted murder. Colonel Jerry, ever practical, helped David to his feet, saying, "Let's get him to my house. He needs to get warm and dry." Looking at me with a hard gaze and adding, "And you need to get that drive to Elena. Now." And I didn't need to be told. Twice, sprinting back to the barn with the little piece of plastic clutched in my fist. When I burst through the door, soaked and muddy, Elena was already moving toward me with a dry towel, taking one look at my face, then at the drive in my hand, and she knew, asking, "Is that?" And I said, "It is. The treasurer defected. It's the real ledger." Her eyes lighting up, since this was the smoking gun investigator Miller had talked about. The proof of criminal intent. She plugged the drive into her laptop, and a moment later, a spreadsheet filled the screen. A work of art, if you appreciate meticulous criminal bookkeeping with columns for dates, illegal fines, cash withdrawals labeled consulting fees, and a separate tab named Homestead Project that made my blood run cold since it was a detailed budget for forcing me out with line items for extra legal fees, private investigators to dig up dirt on me and Elena, and payments to the guards blockading our street. She had been planning this for months, a hostile takeover documented in cold, hard numbers. Elena breathed, "We've got her," while scrolling through the rows, saying, "This is it. Forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy," and it was time to build our case file. For the next few hours, the barn became a war room with the storm raging outside. But inside, we were laser-focused. Elena, the digital wizard, working the ledger and cross-referencing it with evidence we already had while I took on the role of analyst, piecing the story together, pulling up doorbell camera footage from Jerry's house showing Karen's compliance officers doing a late-night walkthrough of my property line weeks ago. A clear case of trespassing, having audio files Elena had secretly recorded at an HOA meeting where Karen blatantly lied about the budget. Then came the big one as we compared the date on the ledger for the Homestead Project kickoff with the official HOA filings Jerry had gotten from the county clerk. Finding a forged document filed just one day after my grandpa's funeral. A lien claiming the estate owed money for non-compliance. Placed against a dead man, and timed perfectly so the notices would get lost in the legal chaos of settling his affairs. Predatory, ghoulish, and utterly illegal. Next, we matched the ledger's payment records to the SCRA violation, finding it in black and white. A bonus paid to her lawyer specifically for expedited action on military-owned property, since she wasn't just ignoring the law, but paying people to break it for her. A mountain of evidence, an avalanche waiting to fall on her, every piece connecting to the next, and painting a picture of a woman so consumed by greed and power that she had become a one-woman crime wave. The missing reserve funds that neighbors had been complaining about for years were drained, siphoned into a shell corporation with a name that was almost comical, Willowbrook Beautification, LLC. And we had everything. The motive, the means, the opportunity, and now the confession from her own treasurer and the playbook he delivered, all documented, organized, and saved in a single encrypted file. But as I looked at the screen at the sum of all her crimes, a nagging feeling hit me since it was good and damning, but not personal enough, proving she was a thief when I wanted to prove she was a fool, wanting to use her own arrogance against her. So I said, "There's something else," and walked over to my grandpa's old roll-top desk that had survived the flood that took out his first house and held all his important papers. I rolled up the top, the smell of old paper and wood polish filling the air, saying, "The ledger is her weapon. The fines are her weapon. I want to use his, rummaging in the back of a deep drawer past old tax returns and property surveys, my fingers closing around a long cylindrical cardboard tube sealed with wax, pulling it out and laying it on the desk. Elena asked, "What's that?" And I said, "It's the original deed. The one from when he sold the land to the developers. The one with the footnote," carefully breaking the old wax seal and unrolling the brittle parchment covered in my grandpa's neat architectural script and the formal signatures of the developers. Finding it at the bottom of the last page, a handwritten addendum, the clause reserving all mineral, oil, and water rights for the 10-acre homestead parcel. But there was more. I'd read it a dozen times, but never with the new subdivision plat map in front of me. So Elena pulled up the map on her screen, and we looked at the old deed, then at the new map, back and forth until we saw it. A slow smile spreading across my face, since it was the most beautiful poetic piece of justice I could have ever imagined. The final nail wasn't in her ledger, but in my grandpa's legacy. Elena whispered, "Holy cow," with wide eyes as she stared at the screen, comparing the old deed to the modern plat map, saying, "Tank, are you seeing this?" And I was seeing it. Better than I ever could have hoped, since the original survey markers detailed in my grandpa's deed were crystal clear. But when the developers had laid out the Willowbrook subdivision, they'd made a mistake. A tiny, insignificant-looking error on the map, probably made by some junior surveyor in a hurry, miscalculating the exact boundary of my grandpa's 10-acre homestead by about 50 feet along the entire eastern edge. It was a sliver of land, but on that sliver, on that 50-foot strip of land that they thought was community property, they had built two things, two very important things: the big fancy resort-style swimming pool and the $1 million stone gatehouse and security office that served as the HOA's headquarters, Karen Cromwell's throne room. I said with slow, grim satisfaction washing over me, "They're on my land. The pool, the gatehouse, it's all on my property." And it wasn't just the subsurface rights anymore, the water under their feet, but the surface too, the physical ground they stood on, having built their most expensive, most prominent community assets on land they never actually owned. My grandpa's foresight being one thing, but the developer's sloppy work being a gift from the universe. And I could hear his voice in my head with a low chuckle. "Always check the survey line, son. Always." I looked at Elena, the gears turning in my head, saying, "You can't sell what you don't own. And you can't build on it either," which changed the entire game since the evidence of her financial crimes would put her in jail. But this would dismantle her empire. The HOA didn't own its own headquarters or its prize amenity, being legally speaking tenants, my tenants, and they were about to be evicted. Elena said, "We need to get this to Miller," her fingers already flying and attaching the scanned deed and annotated plat map to the growing case file. And to Rebecca Webb, being a reporter for a major Austin news outlet, a tenacious journalist who had been sniffing around Karen's HOA for a story on homeowner abuse, having been in touch with her and feeding her bits and pieces. But this was the bombshell she'd been waiting for. Elena finished compiling the file, which had a name, Operation Homestead, containing the ledger, the video of the goons planting evidence, the audio of Karen's threats, the forged documents, the proof of the SCRA violation, and now the land deed, a masterpiece of righteous indignation as she hit send, firing off the encrypted file to 3 people simultaneously. Investigator Miller at the AG's office, my contact at the JAG Corps, and Rebecca Webb, the 3 pillars of law, military, and media. The moment she sent it, a sense of calm descended on the barn as the storm outside was starting to break, the relentless drumming of rain easing to a steady patter since we had done it. Gathered the intel, built the case, and fired the shot, now having to wait for the impact with nothing more to do but hold our ground. Elena asked, "What now?" leaning back in her chair with the exhaustion of the last few days finally showing on her face. And I said, "Now we wait for the cavalry." The generator humming like a steady heartbeat in the quiet barn. The blockade still in place, but feeling less like a cage and more like a protective wall. Karen's goons still out there, but no longer a threat, just sitting ducks. A message popped up on Elena's screen from Miller at the AG's office. The connection spotty. Text only. Likely bouncing off a satellite somewhere. The message brief. Received. Do not engage. Do not leave your property. Help is on the way. Sit tight. The governor declared a storm emergency. The Texas National Guard deployed on state duty to support the AG. I called our guard liaison. Their mission was simple: secure HOA roads and facilities so the court's receiver could take possession. They worked under the sheriff. Traffic, perimeter, flood support, no arrests. I could do that. That was half my military career. Hurry up and wait. We spent the next few hours in suspended animation with Elena monitoring the drone feed while Karen's goons were restless, pacing back and forth at the blockade, Karen herself being a ghost. Not seen since the treasurer's car was pulled from the creek. Holed up in her house and probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong, knowing she was in trouble with the failed framing attempt, and her treasurer disappearing, having to know something was coming. Through the ham radio network, Freddie kept the neighborhood informed, telling them about David Chen's rescue, about the evidence, about the deed, not giving details, but just enough to let them know the tide had turned. And you could feel the shift in the community as porch lights started turning on one by one, a string of silent support along the blockaded street, since they had been afraid for so long but now had hope. The waiting was the hardest part, as the adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Every sound making me jump. Was that a car engine? Karen making a final desperate move? Or the help Miller had promised? As the first gray light of dawn started to creep over the horizon, painting the wet landscape in shades of silver and gray, we heard it. A low rumble that wasn't thunder, but the sound of engines, a lot of them, coming from the main highway heading our way, and I stood at the open barn door with Elena beside me as we watched, since this was it. The end of the siege, the beginning of the reckoning. Karen thinking she had us trapped in here with her, but about to find out she was the one who was trapped. The dawn convoy was a beautiful sight. Not the clumsy pickups Karen had hired, but a professional operation with a line of black SUVs and marked sheriff's department vehicles rolling down the main road, their lights off, moving with quiet, deadly purpose. Not slowing down for Karen's makeshift blockade as the first SUV, a heavy-duty model with a reinforced push bar, simply nudged the contractor's pickup aside as if it were a toy, the truck scraping along the asphalt with a tortured screech of metal, clearing the path with the message being clear. The games were over. I watched from the barn door as the convoy split, half the vehicles peeling off and surrounding Karen's perfectly manicured house, while the other half continued down the street heading for the HOA gatehouse, my gatehouse, U.S. Marshals, with their vests clearly marked pouring out of the SUVs and movings with the fluid efficiency of trained professionals, forming a perimeter around Karen's home since they were there on a federal arrest warrant for wire and mail fraud. Simultaneously, a team of sheriff's deputies and investigators from the Attorney General's office, led by grim-faced investigator Miller, approached the gatehouse where the two guards Karen had posted looked panicked, having been hired to bully residents, not face-down federal agents, dropping their clipboards and putting their hands up before anyone even said a word. It was almost comical. Miller presented a warrant to the ranking deputy, who used a battering ram to open the HOA office door with a single authoritative thud, a deputy serving an emergency state court order, vacating the sham sale while the county clerk recorded the judge's order and canceled the transfer on the spot, title snapping back to my family. Our neighbors were starting to come out onto their porches, drawn by the noise, standing there in their bathrobes with coffee cups in hand, watching the liberation of their neighborhood, as Colonel Jerry gave me a crisp nod from his front lawn, and Freddie's voice came over the comms, breathless with excitement. "It's the cavalry, folks, and they have brought the big guns. The Willowbrook HOA is officially under new management." Elena and I stayed in the barn, watching it all unfold on the drone feed since we had done our part, and this was law enforcement's show now, watching as Miller's team began carrying out boxes of files and computer towers from the HOA office while at Karen's house. The marshals were positioned at every door and window as a man with a megaphone stepped forward. "Karen Cromwell, this is the United States Marshal Service. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands in the air." For a long moment, there was nothing, the only sound being the idling of engines and the nervous chatter of neighbors. Then the garage door of Karen's house began to grind open. But she wasn't coming out to surrender as an expensive black luxury SUV roared out of the garage, its tires squealing on the wet pavement with Karen at the wheel, making a run for it in a desperate, foolish move. She gunned the engine, driving across her own prize-winning lawn and tearing up the sod she'd probably fined other people for damaging, heading for the street and trying to find a gap in the wall of official vehicles. But it was a short chase that lasted about 50 yards as a heavy sheriff's department pickup simply moved forward, blocking her path. Karen swerved, trying to go around it, and drove right into the deep ditch that ran alongside the road. The SUV, with all its off-road capabilities, getting stuck instantly, its front end buried in the mud and back wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The marshals swarmed the vehicle, pulling a sputtering, furious Karen from the driver's seat, still in the floral pink cardigan from the day before, with pearls crooked and splashed with mud, her perfect hair having come undone, looking wild, cornered, and defeated as they cuffed her right there in the middle of her ruined lawn. As they walked her toward a waiting police car, she saw me having stepped out of the barn and standing at the edge of my property watching, our eyes meeting across the distance, her face, which had been a mask of fury, contorting into a snarl of pure hatred. But I didn't smile or gloat, just stood there letting her see me, letting her see the man whose home she tried to steal, the man who was still standing after she had thrown everything she had at him. As the deputies led her past the crowd of neighbors, a quiet cheer went up, not loud or vengeful, but a cheer of relief since the reign of terror was over. And I told her, "You sold my land while I was deployed, so I had the military repossess your whole subdivision by the book." Investigator Miller walked over to me, leaving the controlled chaos of the raid behind, looking tired but satisfied as he said, "Mr. Thomas," and extended a hand, me correcting him with Mark, while shaking it and thanking him for coming, him replying, "We should be thanking you. That evidence package was the tightest case I've seen in 20 years. You did our job for us," gesturing with his head toward Karen, who was being put in the back of a squad car, adding, "She waived her right to remain silent. She's already blaming her treasurer, her lawyer, the developers, everyone but herself." I said, "Sounds about right," and Miller nodded toward my barn, saying, "And that little tidbit about the mineral rights in the deed, that was a masterpiece." The county is already filing an injunction to lock down all HOA assets pending a full investigation. Under the receivership, the guard and sheriff took control of every HOA asset across the subdivision: roads, gatehouse, pool, and office. Homes stayed with owners, which legally means you now control their headquarters. Almost smiling and adding, "I don't think anyone in Texas history has ever foreclosed on their own HOA." The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the storm clouds, the air feeling clean and washed new since the fight was over and the bully was in cuffs. But the work of rebuilding was just beginning. The weeks that followed the dawn raid were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and community meetings as Karen Cromwell's empire crumbled faster than a sandcastle in the tide. The story Rebecca Webb published, going viral as a cautionary tale of HOA overreach picked up by national news outlets. The words, "You can't sell what you don't own," becoming a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. Karen, faced with the mountain of evidence from Operation Homestead, took a plea deal that would put her behind bars for a long time while her cronies on the board all resigned in disgrace. The court appointing a receiver to manage the HOA's affairs, with their first act being to declare all of Karen's fines and liens null and void. A total unconditional victory. But victory on paper and healing a community are two different things, since the damage Karen had done ran deep. Neighbors having been pitted against each other with trust shattered, and the neighborhood feeling broken. So the first step was taking back control, as the court ordered a special election to form a new HOA board. Colonel Jerry, despite his initial reluctance, was nominated for president while I was asked to serve as vice president, the other positions filled by good people, neighbors who had been silenced by Karen, and were now ready to step up. Our first board meeting not in the contested gatehouse, but held on my lawn around the mesquite pit, where we set up folding chairs, served sweet tea and brisket, and just talked, listening to people's stories, their frustrations, their hopes for what Willowbrook could be. Still fear and anger, but for the first time in years, also hope. We drafted new bylaws, stripping away all of Karen's tyrannical rules, slashing the budget and cutting wasteful spending on compliance officers and frivolous projects, making the HOA accountable to the people it served, not the other way around. The gatehouse and pool sitting on my land becoming our biggest bargaining chip. But we didn't evict the HOA, drawing up a lease agreement for $1 a year for 99 years, a gesture of goodwill with the only condition being that the HOA had to be run with transparency and fairness for the benefit of the whole community. A permanent check on any future board's power, since my grandpa's legacy was now the community shield. But the barn, my grandpa's barn, that's where the real healing began, since it had been our war room, our fortress. But now it was time for it to be something more. So we cleaned it out, patched the door Karen had kicked in, and gave it a fresh coat of paint. Hanging flags on the wall, the American flag, the Texas flag, and the flags of all the military branches, calling it Operation Homestead. It started as a simple idea, a place where veterans in the community could come for help navigating VA benefits, help writing a resume, or just help having a cup of coffee with someone who got it, since I knew how hard the transition to civilian life could be, and wanted to make it easier for the men and women coming home now. Then the idea grew as Elena, ever the forward thinker, started a tutoring program for the neighborhood kids in the barn's old loft, while Colonel Jerry started a workshop on emergency preparedness, and neighbor Freddie, our ham radio hero, set up a communications class, the barn becoming the true heart of the community, a place for building things up, not tearing them down, a place for learning, fellowship, and service. A few months after the raid, I was sitting on the barn porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors, the smell of mesquite smoke hanging in the air with Elena beside me, her hand in mine, kids laughing and chasing fireflies near the pond, the sound of a hammer on steel ringing out from inside the barn, where a young Marine I knew was learning some basic welding from another neighbor. It was a good sound, the sound of life, the sound of a community healing itself. I thought about my grandpa and the land, the legacy he'd left me, realizing it wasn't just about the dirt or the mineral rights, but about the principle, since a home is more than just a house. It's a place you defend, a place you belong, a sanctuary. And Karen Cromwell had tried to take that from me, from all of us, but she failed because she never understood what she was up against, thinking she was fighting one man when she was wrong, since she was fighting a soldier, his loyal wife, a retired colonel, a nosy reporter, a brave treasurer, a whole neighborhood. and the enduring spirit of a wise old man who knew that the most valuable things are the ones you can't see. The fight was over, and we had won. Our home was safe. Our community was ours again. And on that quiet Texas evening, that was more than enough.